The nervous system is an amazing collection of neurons and glia, and its whole purpose is to communicate. We've spoken about this when we introduced the tissues of the body. But when we look at the nervous system as an organ system, it's made up of a couple of different things. In actual fact, we divide it into something called the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So let's take a look. Firstly, the central nervous system is made up of the brain. It's made up of the brain stem, It's made up of the cerebellum, which is the small brain at the back, which is exactly what cerebellum means, and the spinal cord. Now, it's called the central nervous system for two reasons. It's called the central nervous system because it sits centrally anatomically. It's right down the middle, right? Brain, brainstem, cerebellum, spinal cord goes straight down the middle. But it's called the central nervous system. And let's just write it like this, CNS, central nervous system. And it's called that also because it's central functionally. That means all the decision making of the body, or all the decision making of our neurons actually occurs in this central nervous system. If we were to take a look at the peripheral nervous system, these are all the nerves that shoot out and away and come back in to the brain and brainstem, and all the nerves that shoot out and away and come back in to the spinal cord. That's known as the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral means it's on the periphery, on the outside. And so these are nerves that just go out and away from the central nervous system and nerves that come back in to the central nervous system. So they're the two divisions that we have. But there's also a better way to functionally divide the nervous system up. And again, it's still central and peripheral, but it goes into a little bit more detail. And this is what I want to now take a look at. So first thing is, we're going to draw up the brain. Brainstem, cerebellum, and spinal cord. So again, we've got the central nervous system here. So let's just again write that, the CNS. Now, a couple of things. If we talk about the nerves that go towards the central nervous system and the nerves that go away from the central nervous system as the peripheral nervous system, let's focus on this side, all the nerves that go in towards the central nervous system. So that could be whether it be towards the brain, the brainstem, or the spinal cord, doesn't matter. We term these sensory signals. They're sensory. They're telling us about information that's sensory. So it's going to be touch, it's going to be smell, it's going to be taste, it's going to be vision, it's going to be hearing, it's going to be one of those things, right? It's sensory. So it tells us about what's happening in the environment and it has to go towards the brain. Now it's always picked up by receptors. So these changes in the environment must be picked up by receptors and sent via these sensory signals towards the brain. Now, if you think back to homeostasis, these sensory signals are also called afferent. Afferent signals, that's an E, afferent. So an afferent signal is a sensory signal, and they all come from receptors who have picked up some sort of change in the environment. Now, what is the change in the environment? Well, there's two major types that we need to look at. It can be what we call somatic sensory. Somatic sensory, or it could be something called visceral sensory. So what this basically means is it information that's coming from a part of the body that we can consciously perceive? So what would that be? Well, we can consciously perceive vision and hearing and taste and touch to the skin, for example. These are just some examples. It's all about, let's highlight this, conscious. What can we become consciously aware of? So this is somatic sensory. Somatic means body, and it's referring to consciously being aware of things. So anything that's vision or hearing or taste or touch of the skin, for example, that we become consciously aware of, it's called somatic sensory. It is picked up by receptors, and those receptors will send an afferent or sensory signal into the central nervous system. This is all the input. Again, this is all peripheral nervous system. Now let's take a look at the output. Oh no, actually, sorry, visceral. Let's take a look at the visceral sensory. So visceral sensory is about the non-conscious or unconscious things. So what do we pick up that's sensory, that's unconscious? Well, think of what's happening in our organs. So changes in our organs. So the diameter of our bowel, for example. You're not aware that your bowel is changing its diameter. Your heart, the way your heartbeat changes, that's unconscious. You're not consciously controlling that. The diameter of your blood vessels, right? These again, it's not an extensive list, but they're examples of, again, it's all unconscious. Unconscious versus conscious. Visceral means organ. So visceral sensory is just telling you it's a sensory signal that's coming from your organs. Now we can have a look at the signal that's coming out. So this is all input, right? That we've just spoken about. Now we want to talk about output. So signals moving out and away. Again, still peripheral nervous system, right? So the signal coming out is known as a motor signal because it's all about movement or making a change, right? And we also, if you remember when we spoke about homeostasis, we call it an efferent signal, going away from the control center. Now, a motor signal is something about movement or change. And it can, again, it needs to go to some sort of effector. Right? Now, the effectors can be very similar to what we just spoke about here. Two different things. The effectors can be somatic motor. Somatic motor, just like somatic sensory. So what did I say somatic meant? It meant of the body. So, and what did I say? It's conscious. So somatic motor is what can you control in regards to some sort of change in your body consciously. Basically, your skeletal muscles. So it's all about that skeletal muscle change. Skeletal muscle. So contraction of that skeletal muscle. And this is, again, conscious. Super important. Now, what's the last one? Well, it's obviously going to be unconscious changes that you can make in the body. And these unconscious changes we call the autonomic motor. Or autonomic like automatic. So autonomic. And what we have here for autonomic, think about it, what can you change? Non-consciously, right? Because it's autonomic, it's automatic. Well, again, it's things like heart. You can change your heart rate. Smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle lines our hollow organs and structures. Blood vessels change the diameter, our reproductive tract, our renal system, for example, and it's also glands. So the three major things that the autonomic motor controls is cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And it's all unconscious. All unconscious. Now, an important point to again highlight here is when we look at, let's find a colour here, when we look at the visceral sensory and its signals moving up, so the afferent signals, and then the motor or efferent going specifically to the autonomic. So all this is autonomic, all of it, right? This part of the peripheral nervous system, which is all unconscious, is part of the peripheral nervous system, and we call it the autonomic nervous system. And there's two divisions of that, which we will talk about in future lectures, called the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. But this is an overview of the divisions of the nervous system.